Peace Collective. I hope you can hear me. This is my second time recording this. Kind of pissed, so we're gonna do our best. So, as you can see by the title of the video, we're gonna be debunking the out of Africa theory. This is a long time in the making for me. So the common consensus amongst scientists is that, like these little RNAs and little things evolved over time, became multicellular organisms, and over time became more complex. And then, eventually apes and different types of primates came along, and then humans are like this version of them, right? And then that originated in Africa, right? According to them. But we're gonna break all of that down today. So let's start with who created this theory. That's speculated, but the person who gets credit is one Charlie Darwin, okay? And that's very important to note because his whole theory was based on a racist perception, especially the time he was born. We know his quotes, okay? He definitely wasn't racist, right? He don't have one racist quote. But anyway, we could even break that down by just reading the title of these things, right? So, the origin of species by means of natural selection and preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. Favored races. So what exactly do they mean? In order to evolve into something more complex, that means the thing that it evolved from was more simplified. So in the out of Africa theory, black people are the first people, and then white people and other races are eventually the more evolved, complex races, right? So we're gonna dive into all of that, and we're gonna show how scientifically they've already disproven that, and how we're gonna have to find a new origin story. And for the people who are like, oh, what are your credentials? My credentials are facts, okay? So pay attention. How about that? Now, we're gonna start off with the structure that they found in Africa, in Zambia, that's 500,000 years old. And that is pushing back the timeline already, because according to the theory, modern Homo sapiens came out of Africa 300,000 years ago, okay? So what scientists are trying to do now is give like Denisovans, give Neanderthals these new intelligent features so that they could kind of take structures like this and just, write them off as some other intelligent being did it. But we're not really going for that kind of story, right? So in 2019, they found unexpected tool uses and structural engineering capabilities and all types of things, right? Which shouldn't be the case before Homo sapiens, but since they've upped the Neanderthals' intelligence level, they're probably gonna try and write that off as nothing. So, before we get into that, 70 years ago, right, Ushikawa man, right, this is the oldest Japanese human fossil. And they tried to use it as evidence that, the whole land bridge, that people migrated from Siberia, all these places up into the Americas. And this fossil was one of their evidences on how these things happen, right? And it turns out that when they did CT scans on it, when they started testing these bones, it ended up being like a hip bone from a bear. Okay, so it's very important to note, especially with people like Charlie Darwin who have, archaeological hoaxes, and you got other skeletons that, scientists are claiming these are fossils that prove these things. There's a lot of hoaxes and things that went on. And we, as people who want to know the truth, we have to be open to these conversations, and we got to accept facts for what they are, right? So if people are lying, people are lying. That don't mean everyone's lying. Or maybe people are mistaken, who knows? We got to call it out for what it is. So that is what it is there. For the people who don't like that, oh well, I know you're mad, we'll deal with it. So, we're going to start getting into some evidence now. Multiple migratory waves out of Africa debunked, specifically South Africa. Okay. DNA from 9,000-year-old skeleton disproves multiple migratory waves out of South Africa. The study reveals nearly unbroken genetic continuity continuity over millennia for indigenous populations. Okay, so what they found is DNA from this 9,000-year-old skeleton actually shows a lot more diversity than what they thought before, right? So according to the evolutionary model, it wasn't as spread out and as diverse. They figure it's from like a single region and then everything spread out. But a lot of the DNA evidence now is showing that there were a lot of different groups and it was a lot more scrambled and mixed, right? So, right, refuting previous assumptions that external groups swept through the region to replace or heavily mix with earlier inhabitants. Okay, so that's the evidence we're starting off with, all right? Let's go a little deeper. So, Miss Leah Cave in Israel. In 2018, a fossilized jawbone and teeth dated between 170 and 190,000 years old. Okay, and for people who don't know, the migratory waves out of Africa into Europe, scientists claim were around 40,000 years ago. Okay, so this jawbone and these teeth discovered in this cave in Israel pushed back that timeline by over 130,000 years. Okay, so we're pushing back the timelines using actual facts. Okay, anyone could look up this discovery in 2018 in Israel, okay, by archaeologists. All right, it wasn't made up by some dude on the internet. Anyone could Google this information and find it out. If you're in love with the out of Africa theory, you might not like that, but we don't like racists, so it is what it is. Deal with it, right? So let's start rolling with some genetic evidence, right? So, death blow to out of Africa theory. Humans migrated into Africa, not out, then bred with other primates. Don't pay attention to things like that's basically scientists think a bunch of interspecies sex happened, because they're a bunch of freaks and weirdos. So when you hear stuff like that, for the collective, for people like us, we know that's the Anunnakis or the Dogons or whatever you want to call those beings. We know it was genetic splicing, and we know there was multiple different events that happened. So for a scientist, they're gonna think interspecies sex. For people like us, we're gonna think genetic splicing. So when you see things like that, just know what we're talking about. All right. A protein found in the saliva samples of sub-Saharan Africans offers evidence that strongly contradicts the out of Africa theory. All right. So not only do we have fossil evidence, we have genetic evidence. So let's get into that. What is the genetic evidence? So, at the University of Buffalo, researchers found that sub-Saharan Africans carry a highly distinct variant of the MUC7 gene, okay, which codes for a saliva protein. Okay, this gene is so distinct that it suggests archaic interbreeding with a now extinct ghost hominin species, challenging the traditional out of Africa theory. Okay, so here you have researchers at the University of Buffalo challenging the out of Africa theory. You don't have me on the internet challenging the out of Africa theory. Does that make sense? I don't think so. Let's continue a little bit. All right? Right, it actually points to a more complex, multi-regional origin, right? Which is what we're saying. It's exactly what we're saying. We're saying that the earth was a lot more connected, and so were the people, and it wasn't little groups and regions of tribal people. And in my last video, we already proved that too. So this is just piling on the evidence. So, when analyzing over 2,500 modern human genomes, researchers found that the MUC7 variant was completely different from the versions found in other humans. Okay? So this is a special type of gene. Right? It was It was so different. It was widely different that even the Neanderthals and Denisovans match other modern humans more closely than the gene in these sub-African tribes. So basically, what we're gonna get into later is that scientists are very obsessed with Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA. And in humans, we have less than 10% of that DNA, yet we have over 20% DNA of other hominins that are so-called ghosts, right? Because we don't know about it. So what we're gonna show is scientists' obsession with these two beings, even though there's so much more going on. Okay. So let's get into that a little bit. Ghost hominins. Scientists concluded that this extreme genetic variation is the result of archaic introgression, meaning that the ancestors of modern sub-Saharan Africans likely interbred with an undiscovered ancient human relative about 150,000 years ago. As I said before, scientists, they're super obsessed with like interbreeding. That's like their answer. If anyone watches the Nature Channel or science programs, they're very obsessed with how animals have sex because they're kind of weirdos. So that's nothing new to people who like nature channels and stuff. You know, sometimes you got to change the channel and mom comes in because it gets a little weird with the animals and stuff. But let's move on. What's the impact of this gene discovery, right? While the out of Africa model points that modern humans originated from a single location in Africa before spreading across the globe, this saliva protein adds to the growing body of genetic evidence suggesting that modern humans' evolution was much more interconnected with modern lineages and interbreeding with various archaic hominins. So we see the obsession, right, with the interbreeding. But we know that there's ghost DNA and lineages of beings that we share DNA with that we have no idea, where they come from. We haven't found fossil evidence of it. And the reason is because in order to make a fossil, you need a very specific condition. And for some reason, cataclysms fit that description. So a lot of the fossils that we have, most of the fossils we have are actually due to cataclysms, right? And most fossils that existed are all gone. So our history is based on a very limited spectrum. Now, this is a fossil that debunks the out of Africa theory. According to scientists, it's called Apodema 1. Okay, a 210,000-year-old skull in Greece rewrites human migration out of Africa. Okay, it's the oldest known Homo sapien remains found in Eurasia. This discovery predates previous European modern human fossils by more than 160,000 years. Okay, so for the people who believe, 40,000 years ago, a bunch of Homo sapiens came out of Africa and banged a bunch of Neanderthals to create Europeans, we have evidence that that didn't happen, okay? And if you want to go a step further, no scientist could show any experiment ever that demonstrates interspecies sex even happen. Okay, we share the genetics, and we share the genetics with a bunch of animals. We share genetics with fruit flies, and those genetics aren't really like the traits and stuff like that, but we'll get into stuff like that in the other video. All right, after this video, I'm gonna do a biology video where we get deeper into DNA and all that stuff and how it happened, all the new discoveries and how that's changing the perception a little bit for the people who want to. The people stuck in their old ways, stay in your old ways. You don't care. So another piece of evidence to show the out of Africa theory is old and outdated. Okay, it's called Anadoluvis, Turkey. Okay, an 8.7 million year old extinct ape discovered at the fossil site in central Turkey. This remarkably well-preserved partial cranium is challenging the traditional out of Africa theory. Okay, it suggests the group of apes and humans may have first evolved in Europe and the Mediterranean Sea, moving into Africa. Okay, so just like the last genetic piece of evidence, right? The MCU gene, right? Where they're saying people migrated into Africa, not out of Africa. This fossil also suggests that people migrated into Africa, not out of Africa, right? So, why does that matter? These were experiments conducted a few years ago. Now scientists are saying Africans have about maybe up to 2% Neanderthal DNA, but before that, researchers at Harvard said that Africans are the only pure-blooded humans. Every other race has Neanderthal DNA, right? Including a separate study conducted by Dr. Benjamin Verna and Dr. Joshua A. Key from the University of Washington, okay? And they tested about 286 East Asians and 379 Europeans, and they came to the conclusions that Africans didn't have Neanderthal DNA, which now, recently, they're trying to say that Africans do have Neanderthal DNA, so that's a conversation to be forwarded with more information that comes, okay? But why is that important? All right? So this is another fossil that challenges these ideas that are given to us, right? Africa's linear evolution debunked. Fossil discoveries in Ethiopia's Afar region completely reshaped our understanding of human evolution by disproving the classic linear ape-to-human model. Instead of a single straight line, these findings reveal a crowded, branching family tree where multiple early hominins, right, including Australopithecus species, coexisted and co-adapted with each other. All right. So as you can see, we got genetic evidence, we have fossil evidence, we have multiple pieces of evidence from multiple different scientists and multiple different fields of science, all suggesting that the out of Africa theory is outdated. Okay. And what we're suggesting is if scientists really care, then let's start diving into these subjects, right? Because people like me on the internet shouldn't be the people who are being the truth seekers or trying to find the truth. And, you know, the people who practice science, they take a lot of years to study these things, and they know these talking points, and they know that engineering, they know the equations, they know the technologies, and that's what puts them in a position to be the experts and the authorities. But truth and facts overrides everything. So as much as we have to respect the experts, we also are allowed to question. That's the very definition of science, is to question, right? We, like, a lot of things that we know were proven by high schoolers or proven by people who aren't even experts and within the field of science, because science is a very encompassing thing. But sometimes people want to gatekeep, and some people need a God to worship. So whether it's a religious book or whether it's a scientist telling them what to think and how to feel, people need a God to worship to tell them how to think and how to feel. And for the people who don't need that, that's what this series is about, to bring information and light, you know, for people who want to know a bunch of cool little facts that they can add to their own personal little repertoire, you know. So, we're gonna get a little bit into this DNA, not too much. In my biology video, we'll get deeper, but we're gonna just touch on it lately. And a lot of people in the Americas, when they take DNA tests, right, black people, we'll get into the terms black and African, and hopefully we could find like a better term. But for now, I guess I'll use black. But basically, the people from the Americas, their DNA comes back 70% African, up to 70%, even more. And we're gonna debunk that. But first we need to understand that just because you have dark skin doesn't mean you're from Africa, right? But let's get into how we kind of got to these points, right? So there was a guy named Joseph Jenkins Roberts, right? And what he did is he took 5,200 indigenous people from the Americas. He actually brought them to West Africa, right? So there was a lot of migrations of people actually moving into the Africas from the Americas and not the opposite. And so some of the genetic markers, when they match like the West African, they're actually matching with not people necessarily from the African region, surprisingly. And that has to do with him. All right, so specifically him, that happened between the 1820s and the 1900s, right? They were sent to Liberia, different places, right? And basically, it was done by a name named Joseph Jenkins Roberts. Okay. And that partially explains why people are coming up with those type of genetic codes. Okay. But what exactly is DNA and how does it work, right? So, locating genetic barcodes. The genome is a small variation known as a single nucleotide. Okay, certain, we're gonna call them snaps, are geographically they're geographically concentrated, right? So they basically act like codes for different regions. So people from different regions, they have these genetic markers, and when scientists find the DNA, they kind of match these different markers, right? So that's basically how that works. And then they have something called a reference panel. So a reference panel is they have different people's DNAs, and then they compare it to other people's DNAs, and they do their best to find people who have been in the region for many generations, right? So that they could do their due diligence and make sure the genetic markers are accurate, right? But there's different types of DNA, right? You have the SNAPS one, you have autosomal, right? And basically that is the 22 pairs of chromosomes you get from both parents. And it's scanned and broken into thousands of pieces that the algorithm could check, right? And then they could check the reference panel, and then they could see what's going on. And what's very important to note is that scientists use AI and computers for this type of stuff, okay? So they're not necessarily doing a lot of this stuff nowadays. It's the AI picking up these markers and doing all these things, right? Because DNA is a huge, huge code. And then you have chromosome painting. So just like Wilhelm Reif and his microscope where he paints the things and you can see them, they do the same thing with the DNA, right? They basically paint it and you can see the little chromosomes and stuff going on, right? And that's how they kind of get an idea where you're from. But it is guesswork. Okay, then the results, the DNA between groups of people can paint a picture of the environment, right, for example. But it doesn't tell you exactly where people are from, right? So a good example of how DNA tests don't tell you where people are from is, let's say you take a DNA test and it comes back British, right? What I'm about to show is that, I'm gonna show later in this video that the scientists already proved that white people, their origins don't go past 6,000 years, right? And that people in Europe actually had darker skin up to 3,000 years ago. So someone who's light skinned, he's from Britain, how your origin is British, right? When you're more like an Anglo-Saxon, you're more from the Caucasus, right? And then how do people from the Americas take DNA tests, how do they not come back British or Irish or all these things when the original occupants were darker skinned, right? 70% African. None of that stuff makes sense. So they're actually finding people's DNA that's like different than other people. Like this man, Albert Perry, right? When geneticists tested the DNA of Albert Perry, right, an African American man from South Carolina, they discovered a completely unique Y chromosome that did not match any known human male lineage, pushing back the timeline of the Y chromosome. So, we're pushing back timelines, y'all. We're pushing back time from 300,000 years to 400,000 years to 500,000 years to 600,000 years. This African theory is getting bumped around, beat up. And actually, that Y chromosome has been found in the embryo people living in Cameroon too. So since then, we found other people with this same Y chromosome. Okay, so this wasn't some crazy anomaly, right? Oops, I just closed all this. It's very important to note that our history is important and we need to know where we come from, right? And we don't need another person to tell us that. We could do our own due diligence. So now we're gonna get into the ghost DNA a little bit. We're gonna start talking about that, right? So every single race has ghost DNA, right? Specifically, there's a mysterious population that gave us 20% of our DNA, okay? And these results came from a landmark 2025 study published in Nature Genetics. This study revealed that modern Homo sapiens are actually braided river formed from a merger of two distinct ancestral populations, right? So we aren't just Neanderthal, Denisovan, right? They stem from population A and population B, right? And they say around 300,000 years ago, these two groups fused back together with a minority population, contributing roughly 20% of our overall human genome. Okay? So, for the Denisovan Neanderthal DNA, 2%, 1%, this is 20% of our DNA from this ghost lineage that we don't even know nothing about. All right? It's time we start focusing on things that matter a little more. So, they consider these genetic inheritances to to our brain development, right? Genetic modeling suggests that the 20% chunk of DNA we inherited from this mysterious population contains vital genes linked to neurological development and brain function. Neanderthal DNA though, right? Neanderthal Denisovan. So, an interesting thing to note is that this particular ghost lineage didn't really have like haplogroups, or we can't really establish that. And this is actually the reason why. Okay. Haplogroups track single parent lines. A haplogroup refers to strictly a specific lineage in either the Y chromosome DNA from the father or the mitochondrial DNA from the mother, right? The 20% DNA given to us by this ghost lineage is autosomal DNA, right? Which is basically nuclear DNA, which is the 22 pairs of chromosomes, right? That we get mixed up. So, it's a little different than the DNA we're getting from these Neanderthals and Denisovans, right? The lineage is completely archaic. Haplogroups like R1b, J, or LO are systems used to map relatively recent migrations of modern Homo sapiens over the last few tens of thousands of years. The mysterious population from our main lineage nearly 1.5 million years ago, long before modern haplogroups ever formed. So before haplogroups even formed, we already had these types of DNA. Deeper than that, when it comes to DNA tracing, you can't even go back 4 or 5 generations accurately. So a lot of this stuff is made up, and they won't even tell you that. We'll get deeper than that in the biology video. We'll get into that. It's really early, so I'm sorry if I'm like, nah, So, humans share 1 to 3% of DNA with Neanderthals and 3 to 6% with Denisovans. Okay, and we share 20% with this mysterious population. So for my people who know math, right, what's more important? You tell me. We're gonna go over ghost populations within different regions, so people know that it isn't specifically for the Americas. This isn't specifically for Africa. Everybody has ghost lineages everywhere, right? So, unknown Aboriginal ancestors to the Americas. They call it haplotype A2, right? Ancient DNA study in Colombia finds unknown civilizations 6,000 years ago. DNA analysis of 21 ancient skeletons reveal unique genetic lineages with no known living descendants or ancestral ties to any ancient groups in the Americas. Right? So, for the Americas, one of the ghost populations, they consider that haplogroup A2. Okay? Very simple. right? They say this mysterious population thrived in the high plains of central Colombia for thousands of years. However, the ancient DNA shows that the distinct genetic lineage completely disappeared from the region about 2,000 years ago. I'm gonna make a video on history so we could see how, like a few thousand years ago, a lot of people mysteriously vanished. And it's all gonna make sense and tie in. But for right now, with one example, it sounds kind of crazy. So I'll gather more information on this later so it makes more sense. And we could get deeper into that type of subject. So here's a ghost population of some Africans, right? It's called haplotype N. Scientists discovered the 7,000-year-old remains of two female pastoralist mummies in the rock shelters of southwestern Libya. Their DNA does not match any modern human populations of the sub-Saharan background. Okay? So, ghost DNA all over the world. Okay. These mummies had no outside genetic missing. It suggests these practices spread through cultural diffusion, the exchange of ideas and lifestyle choices rather than invading populations. Researchers found that while they lacked modern sub-Saharan African ancestry, they unexpectedly retained more Neanderthal genetic traces than most other local groups. Okay, so this archaic population somehow was in communication with Neanderthals. And for people who've seen my older videos, we know Neanderthals are like subspecies of the pygmies, and we know Denisovans are like subspecies of the giants. Okay. For those who don't know, they can look back at my old content where we talk about that. So, here's a ghost lineage of an Asian populations, right? And they call that haplogroup M61, right? A genetic study has uncovered a previously unknown human lineage that survived the end of the last ice age, challenging long-held assumptions about how ancient populations evolved and interacted during one of the most transformative periods in human history, right? So in my last video, you could see that people were actually making technological advancements within the Ice Age, which also challenges some of their theories, and this is more evidence, right? The archaeological site near Beijing, right, that's where they found it. By analyzing DNA, the extracted remains, scientists revealed a complex and surprisingly resilient human story, one which multiple lineages coexisted, adapted, and sometimes disappeared without leaving a trace. Okay? So all over the world you have these mysterious populations, and they go missing, and because there's no fossil evidence, they're not even written into the story, and then people think they have the whole story, and we don't even know what we're talking about technically because of how fossils are made, right? At the heart of the discovery is approximately 11,000-year-old individual whose genetic profile does not match any previously identified human populations. Researchers found that this individual belonged to a deeply divergent Northeast Asian lineage that likely split from other human groups tens of thousands of years ago. Okay? So, as we continue to dive into the evidence, we see there's a lot of archaic groups and different subspecies of what they're going to call archaic humans or primates that have, not really been talked about because we don't have the fossil evidence to actually, prove their existence besides the genetics, which they're finding now, right? So, even the Australians have ghost lineages, right? And they call that haplogroup EH1, right? So beyond Neanderthal and Denisovan heritage, large-scale genomic analysis of indigenous Australian genomes have revealed traces of an entirely uncategorized and ghost-like human species. Geneticists hypothesize that as modern humans migrated out of Africa, and we already debunked this out of Africa stuff, right? So this is now scientists are trying to theorize based on their own racist views, right? That they don't even know that they were taught, right? And that's why it's so important to study so we could find these answers out. Right? They migrated out of Africa, interbred, there goes the interbreeding, with the unknown early human lineage in Asia. The genetic remnants of this ancient group are carried by Aboriginal Australians and Pacific Islanders today. Genomic studies have also traced an ancient ghost-like internal migration that swept across Australia around 10,000 to 4,000 years ago. Okay, so thousands of years ago, these groups, they just go missing, right? It's gonna become a common theme, but I'm gonna make a video that we can see all of that. Make more sense. Right? This population's movement had a sweeping cultural impact, but left a distinct, varied genetic footprint across modern Aboriginal Australians, right? So, as we can see, all around the world, you have these ghost populations that come up within our genetics, and a lot of the time, the percentage is higher than the Neanderthals and the Denisovans, right? So it's very important when we're trying to paint this picture that we have all the facts. So now we're going to continue to debunk the out of Africa theory by showing that white people haven't existed past 6,000 years. So everybody's DNA that's black can't just come back to Africa, right? So the Australian Research Center for Ancient DNA shows that Europeans' ancestry doesn't go back 6,000 years, right? The research found that the genetic signatures of early European hunter-gatherers and the first farmers largely disappeared or were heavily replaced around 6,500 years ago. Again, these groups just disappearing a few thousand years ago and then being replaced with other people, right? Very important to note when we talk about DNA and they talk about the region you're from, right? Because they don't even know. They're just going by what they see now. The person is there now, so they think that's where they're from. So then, right? That's how they're gonna go off. That's how they're gonna go off their information, right? So let's go a little deeper than that. Research shows that specific traits associated with white European populations evolved relatively recently. The genetic variants for lighter skin, for example, spread rapidly through European populations much later, and dark-skinned and hair remained dominant among ancient Europeans well after the initial, let's see what it says, well after the initial migrations. So, about what, a few thousand years ago, people just showed up, right? Caucasus Mountains, they spread out. And then now when you do a DNA test, they're gonna tell you those people are from these regions like Britain, Ireland, and that doesn't even make sense. Genetically, scientifically, at all. Know who you are and where you come from. Here's another one. Dark-skinned European Aboriginals. A study co-authored by Professor Guido Barbuhani of the University of Ferrara found that DNA suggested Europeans were mostly dark-skinned before Roman times. Finally, they explained that the genomes dated between 3,000 years and 1,700 years ago, during the Iron Age, showed a mixture of dark, intermediate, and light skin in different areas of Europe and Western Asia during the Neolithic period. Okay? Around 63% of ancient Europeans had dark skin, while only 8% had pale skin. 8% of Europeans had pale skin. And if you go take a DNA test right now, if you're black from America, most of y'all are not going to come out European. Why not? Why not? If there was dark-skinned people all over, right, and people's skin varied, the skin colors varied, right? But there's people all over the world, right? How are you gonna associate everyone just from Africa? You know how? Racism, that's how. Pseudoscience, that's how. So, 15,000 years ago in the Caucasus region, said study author, he explained that the earliest light-skinned individuals were farmers who spread across Europe during the Neolithic period, replacing the hunter-gatherers. Right? So we see groups of people taking over other people's territories, right? So they come from someone else, they take over, right? Then they're there now, and you take a DNA test, and they're gonna say those people are from there. It is one of the biggest guessing games in the world, DNA. DNA can't even tell you who your mother is if they don't have her sample, okay? So if you right now was to give a scientist your DNA and you had no idea who your mother was and they didn't have her DNA, they cannot tell you who your mother is. Yet they're gonna tell you who your mother's mother is based on a few markers. I'm telling y'all, bro, open your minds. So, now that we know the out of Africa theory is debunked, now we got to take these other terms that they created, which are white and black. Okay, and these terms were established in the 1600s, and these terms have nothing to do with like race. Okay, they have to do with political things. All right, politics. So the 1600s for control reasons, right? Before this era, people identified primarily with their specific nationalities, kingdoms, or religious groups rather than a broad skin color. Okay, so just know we're dealing with fairly recent racist science, pseudoscience. Right? Why? Let's get into a few of the reasons. Right? Colonial laws. Legal systems in colonies like Virginia and Maryland began using these terms white and Negro, black, right, to legally separate indentured laborers and prevent unified rebellions. So, they literally created race so that we wouldn't rebel together. They literally separated us. And we got the history on it. And people still don't care. Isn't that incredible? Is that correct? But they could tell you the truth and you still wouldn't care. Right? Social control. Ruling elites promoted these distinct racial labels after events like Bacon's Rebellion to create a legal hierarchy and divide the working class based on skin color rather than economic status. So, using the term white and black, we're still going under the colonizers' science, right? Not fair. So, side note, question posed to the people. For specifically black people, which we know black doesn't exist, right? You're now all from Africa, and black clearly doesn't exist. What would be the proper term to describe y'all, right? Or people, right? Then there's no white and there's no, how do we describe ourselves, right? So, we should get deeper into these questions to find the answers so we could address each other appropriately without disrespecting or using the colonizers' pseudoscience, right? Respectfully. And then shifting identities. Prior to this legal and social engineering, European laborers and African laborers often worked, lived, and married alongside each other with shared social standing. So, for the people who are racist now, who hate each other for whatever reason, you hate this man or this woman and this woman because some colonizing king racist bastard told you to in the 1600s, and your stupid ass is still running with that pseudoscience. Like, how goofy are you for real? Like, think about it. Like, look in the mirror, right? If you really a self-reflective person, and think about how fucking goofy that is. Really. Seriously. Seriously. So, to end this video, right, we're gonna show how racism can be viewed from a lens, right? I'm gonna tell you how. So most skeletons found in southern China are negroid. Why would they be negroid? It's because of certain phenol features, right? So you think, oh, because they got a big nose, or they got right like a wide nose, they're African, or oh, if they got high cheekbones, they're like Native American, right? But let's get into that, right? So actually, they're not negroids, right? That's outdated eugenic science, okay? So wider nasal cavities and broader faces are adaptations to warm tropical environments and not indications of recent African evolution, okay? How does that make sense? Think about the Olmec heads in the South Americas that they're saying, oh, they're black because they have these certain phenotypes and phenol features. No, you're still a slave to your mind, right? Think about how Obama is related to all the other presidents. If you're gonna go strictly off phenotypes, you're never gonna know anything about DNA and genetics and how it works, okay? So we're more interconnected than what we think. And so that's the video. I appreciate everyone who watches it. Thank you so much. The next video is gonna be on biology. I already explained that. Right now I'm recording this in Israel, so it's pretty cool, something different. I'm in my girlfriend's family's house, so I don't want to be too loud or take too long in this video. Just know I'm very appreciative of people who watch. For people who want to know facts, go into the links in these descriptions and save these links and citations and create your own models, right? This channel is about building, right? So I would love to collaborate with people so we can push the science further, right? But besides for that, have a great day or night wherever you're from. Thanks for watching. Peace.